the serial killer Iceberg, a journey into the darkest corners of the human mind. Each tier takes us deeper, from the killer's history cannot forget to the ones buried in silence, hidden by time, fear, or deliberate erasure. This is not about fascination. It's about truth, and the question no one wants to ask: how does a human being become this? There will be no comfort here, no excuses, no redemption. Only the descent, layer by layer, into the minds of those who chose to destroy what made them human. Viewers' discretion is advised.
Tier 1, Ted Bundy, United States, 1970s. It began in Seattle in 1974. Women vanished in daylight, one from a college dorm, another from a crowded park. There were no screams, no witnesses, just the same description whispered by those who'd seen something. A man with a broken arm, driving a small beige Volkswagen. He said his name was Ted. He looked like the man every parent would trust. Handsome, well-spoken, polite. Ted Bundy moved through life like he belonged everywhere. In classrooms, on law school campuses, behind the desk of a suicide hotline. He had a smile that made people lower their guard. No one imagined that same man could be hunting them. Bundy's pattern was calculated. He feigned injury to gain sympathy, luring women close before striking them unconscious with a blunt object. Then came the silence. The long drives into the forest, where he strangled his victims and left their bodies scattered across mountain trails. Sometimes he returned to those sites, days later, when the world had moved on, to revisit the horror he'd created. It wasn't just murder, it was possession. When police finally connected the disappearances across Washington, Utah, and Colorado, Bundy had already evolved. He changed his tactics, shifted states, and continued killing. A young woman named Carol Durant escaped his car in 1975. Her survival cracked his illusion of invincibility. When investigators searched Bundy's Volkswagen, they found a ski mask, rope, and handcuffs. Still, he charmed everyone, even his interrogators. He was too educated, too polite, too normal. In 1977, Bundy escaped custody twice, once leaping from a courthouse window, another time slipping through a hole in a jail ceiling. He vanished for months. By the time he reappeared, it was in Florida, where the violence erupted without restraint. January 15th, 1978. The Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University became a slaughter scene. Bundy crept through the dark halls, bludgeoning and strangling 4 women as they slept. 2 survived, broken and bloodied. Minutes later, he attacked again. Another student in her apartment. The brutality was no longer hidden behind charm. A few weeks later, a simple traffic stop ended the nightmare. The officer noticed the nervous man behind the wheel didn't match the fake name he gave. Fingerprints confirmed it: Ted Bundy. At trial, he defended himself, turning the courtroom into a stage. He flirted with reporters, smiled for cameras, and proposed to a woman in the gallery, all while facing the deaths of more than 30 women. The jury saw through the act. He was convicted and sentenced to death. On January 24, 1989, Bundy met the electric chair in Florida State Prison. Outside, hundreds cheered as the generator powered up. When the lights flickered, the crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in relief, because Bundy had proven something that terrified everyone. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and asks for help. Jeffrey Dahmer, United States, 1978 to 1991. To anyone who met him, Jeffrey Dahmer seemed painfully ordinary, a quiet man, polite, soft-spoken, almost timid. He clocked in at a chocolate factory each morning, smiled politely to his neighbors, and spent his evenings alone in a small Milwaukee apartment. No one saw danger in him, and that's exactly why he could keep killing for over a decade. Dahmer's story began in 1978, not long after high school. His first victim was a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, whom he picked up under the pretense of company. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell and dismembered the body in his parents' basement. From that moment on, murder became his only way to hold on to people, to make them stay when real life wouldn't. By the late 1980s, Dahmer was living in apartment 213 on North 25th Street. On paper, he was just another lonely man. In reality, it was a laboratory of horror. Every victim he brought home was male, often young, gay, or marginalized. Men he met in bars, outside clubs, or at bus stops. He offered them money, drinks, or photographs, anything to gain their trust. Once inside, he drugged them, then strangled them, quietly, as if trying to stop them from leaving one final time. When it was over, he didn't dispose of them like most killers would. Dahmer kept skulls, hearts, and bones as trophies. He photographed the bodies at every stage, alive, unconscious, dismembered, building an album of possession. To keep what he couldn't preserve, he dissolved flesh in acid and flushed the liquid down the toilet. It wasn't rage, it was obsession. He wanted his victims close, even after death. Part of him, forever. Neighbors had long complained of the stench coming from his apartment. Some described it as spoiled meat. Others said it smelled like decay. Police came once after a teenage boy escaped, dazed, naked, bleeding. But Dahmer convinced them it was a lover's quarrel. The boy was returned to him. Hours later, he was dead. That single mistake allowed Dahmer to continue for 2 more years. It finally ended on July 22, 1991. Tracy Edwards, another would-be victim, escaped and flagged down police, one wrist still bound by handcuffs. When officers entered Dahmer's apartment, what they found defied comprehension. Barrels filled with acid, a freezer with severed heads, photographs of mutilated bodies, and human remains arranged like trophies. The smell was unbearable. The silence that followed, worse. When questioned, Dahmer didn't fight. He confessed to 17 murders with chilling precision, describing every detail, every photograph, every moment. He spoke not with hatred, but with emptiness. "I didn't want them to leave," he said. "I wanted them to stay." In 1992, Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. The families of his victims filled the courtroom, demanding answers, demanding rage, anything human. He gave them none. 3 years later, in 1994, while cleaning the prison bathroom, Dahmer was beaten to death by another inmate. The man who spent his life controlling life and death finally lost control himself. Jeffrey Dahmer's name became synonymous with horror, not just for what he did, but for how calmly he did it. A man who smiled, spoke softly, and killed without sound. Proof that the quietest person in the room can be hiding the loudest nightmare of all. John Wayne Gacy, United States, 1972 to 1978. In 1970s suburban Chicago, John Wayne Gacy was seen as the model citizen. He was a successful businessman, active in local politics, and volunteered as a clown for children's parties. Neighbors saw him as a friendly, trustworthy man who always had a smile ready. But behind that mask, Gacy hid the darkness of a monster. But behind his unassuming smile and friendly demeanor, Gacy harbored a terrifying secret. He was gay, and his desire to control young men drove him to a dark and deadly obsession. Between 1972 and 1978, at least 33 young men and boys vanished after crossing paths with Gacy. Most were runaways or teens looking for work, and Gacy knew how to lure them in. He offered them jobs, food, or simply a place to stay. Once inside his home, the illusion of kindness vanished. He would charm his victims, even performing magic tricks before trapping them with handcuffs. They had no chance to escape. Gacy's method of killing was disturbingly methodical. He strangled his victims, using a tourniquet made from rope and a stick, slowly tightening it until they stopped breathing. He then dismembered their bodies, burying them in the crawl space beneath his house. As the space filled, he began throwing the remains into nearby rivers. The house was a private graveyard, where Gacy's need for control and possession over his victims was satisfied. Neighbors noticed a strange smell emanating from Gacy's house, but he explained it away with plumbing issues. He even continued to host barbecues and community parties, maintaining the facade of the friendly neighbor. It wasn't until December 11th, 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Peast disappeared, that the nightmare began to unravel. Peast had told his mother he was going to meet Gacy about a job, and when police investigated, they discovered the unthinkable: human remains buried beneath the house and in nearby rivers. Gacy was arrested, and the full scale of his crimes was revealed. Gacy confessed to the murders in chilling detail, describing how he had strangled his victims and kept their bodies. He showed no remorse, saying that he wanted the young men to stay with him, even in death. He was convicted of 33 murders and sentenced to death in 1980. For 14 years, Gacy remained on death row, giving interviews, painting clown portraits, and continuing to perform for the cameras. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final words were a cruel, flippant "kiss my ass." For all his charm and manipulation, Gacy's end was a reminder that evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it stands in plain sight, smiling, shaking hands, and wearing a clown's mask. Richard Ramirez, United States, 1980s. In the early 1980s, Richard Ramirez blended into the crowded streets of Los Angeles like a shadow, unnoticed by those around him. He wasn't a figure of menace in the eyes of the public. To them, he was just another drifter, tall, thin, and unremarkable. But by 1985, the city was living in terror. Homes were locked, windows sealed, and whispers of fear filled the air. Someone was breaking into houses at night, leaving nothing but murder and chaos behind. No pattern, no warning, just pure terror. They called him the Night Stalker. Ramirez's method was random, and it was this randomness that made him so terrifying. He killed men and women, the elderly and the young, each victim a chance encounter. The brutality varied, but his signature remained: forced entry, mutilation, and a chilling obsession with Satanism. Pentagrams were scrawled on walls in lipstick. His victims were not just killed, but tortured, leaving them in positions that sent a message of control, chaos, and fear. Ramirez's crimes started in 1984, with the brutal killing of Jenny Vincow, a 79-year-old woman, in her apartment. The crime scene was shocking, but it was just the beginning. The attacks became increasingly violent, and soon the city was paralyzed with fear. At the height of his spree, Ramirez's randomness made him unpredictable. No area was safe. No one could escape. He left victims terrified, not just by his actions, but by his untraceable nature. His childhood was marked by violence. As a teenager, he witnessed the murder of his cousin's wife, a traumatic event that left an indelible mark on his psyche. By the time he reached California, he had already committed crimes of theft, assault, and burglary. His first murder came just a few months after he arrived. The need for control and the pursuit of power through violence were already ingrained in him. It wasn't until the summer of 1985 that Ramirez's reign of terror began to unravel. A break came when a fingerprint from a stolen car led police to his name. The public's nightmare had a face. Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old man with a criminal past. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to be recognized. The following morning, Ramirez walked into a convenience store and saw his own face on the front page of the Los Angeles Times. Panic hit him, and he bolted, running through the streets, only to be recognized by the local community. Neighbors chased him, and soon the police arrived to make the arrest. In court, Ramirez was defiant, even smiling as he declared, "Hail Satan," and showed off a pentagram carved into his palm. His arrogance was unsettling, as if he believed his notoriety was just another form of power. Convicted of 13 murders, he was sentenced to death in 1989. Despite years of appeals, he remained on death row, still believing his charisma would somehow free him. Ramirez finally died in 2013, not from the execution he had been sentenced to, but from cancer. The terror Ramirez inflicted was not just in the murders, but in the profound fear he instilled in an entire city. He didn't just kill, he tormented the public by creating an unpredictable monster who could appear anywhere. His capture didn't end the horror, it merely ended his reign of terror. The city of Los Angeles and the families he destroyed could finally breathe again. Andrei Chikatilo, Soviet Union, 1978 to 1990. In the eyes of the public, Andrei Chikatilo seemed like an unremarkable man. He was quiet, polite, and kept to himself. A middle-aged teacher in the Soviet Union, he blended in with the crowd, almost invisible. His life appeared ordinary. He worked, went home, and did what was expected of him. But beneath the surface of normalcy, Chikatilo harbored a darkness that would terrorize the Soviet Union for over a decade. Between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo killed at least 53 victims, most of them young women and children, but also young men who lived on society's edges, the ones who went unnoticed. He carefully planned each murder, luring his victims with promises of food, shelter, or help. Some he met on the streets, others in parks or train stations. They followed him, trusting the stranger who appeared harmless. None of them would ever return home. Chikatilo's first known victim was Yelena Zakotnova, a 9-year-old girl he encountered in a park. He offered her candy and promised to take her home. Once they were alone, he strangled her, silencing her screams. The brutality of the murder didn't end there. He stabbed her repeatedly in the chest, then mutilated her body, cutting off her genitals, stabbing her in the abdomen, and leaving behind a scene of sickening violence. This first act set the tone for his future crimes. His victims were not just killed, but desecrated. As the years went on, Chikatilo became more reckless, more brazen. He didn't kill out of rage or revenge. His crimes were about control. In another horrific case, he lured Sergei, a teenage boy, to a secluded spot near a train station. There, he attacked him with a knife, stabbing him repeatedly before tearing into his flesh. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a ritualistic act, a twisted need to assert power over the most vulnerable. The Soviet Union, however, refused to believe that a serial killer could be operating in their midst. Authorities dismissed the killings as isolated incidents, unable to connect the dots. It wasn't until 1990, when Chikatilo had already claimed 43 victims, that a detective finally began to take notice. The breakthrough came when a detective observed Chikatilo's odd behavior and peculiar mannerisms. He was brought in for questioning, and when confronted with the evidence, Chikatilo confessed to his crimes without hesitation. His chilling nonchalance during the confession was unsettling. He spoke of his killings with a matter-of-fact attitude, explaining how he was driven by an uncontrollable urge to dominate and destroy. Chikatilo's trial became a spectacle. He remained detached as the details of his brutal acts were read aloud, but his lack of remorse made his actions even more horrifying. He showed no emotion as he spoke of his victims and his need to violate and control them. He seemed completely devoid of empathy, a man who had hidden in plain sight for years. In 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was sentenced to death. His execution, carried out by a single shot to the back of the head, marked the end of a terrifying chapter in Soviet history. Yet for the people of Rostov, the horror didn't end with his death. The knowledge that the butcher of Rostov had lived among them, hidden behind his guise of normalcy, left a scar that time couldn't heal. Tier 2. Eileen Wuornos, United States, 1989 to 1990. To the world, Eileen Wuornos seemed like just another broken woman, a prostitute, a drifter, a woman lost in the cracks of society. She was seen as a victim, someone shaped by years of abuse, neglect, and violence. Eileen had been in and out of foster care, suffered sexual assault as a child, and found herself on the streets, selling sex for survival. She was a woman hardened by the world's cruelty, with a tough, bitter exterior that masked the trauma inside her. It all began in 1989 on a lonely stretch of highway in Florida. Eileen had been picked up by Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old man who offered her money in exchange for sex. To him, she was just another woman, another transaction. But for Eileen, it was more. She had already been through the torture of being used by men throughout her life, her trust shattered by countless encounters that left her feeling less human and more like an object. Mallory tried to assault her, and in that moment, something snapped. She later claimed he had threatened to kill her. In self-defense, she shot him 6 times with a .22 caliber pistol, leaving his body in a remote area near Daytona Beach. In Eileen's mind, it wasn't murder. It was survival. But this wasn't just an isolated act of self-preservation. It would happen again and again. She would kill only men. Over the next few months, Eileen killed 6 more men. Each encounter started the same way. She offered sex in exchange for money. She would lure them to secluded areas, and once they were alone, she would kill them. A single shot to the face or back. Eileen's victims were often vulnerable, just like she had been. Men who took advantage of her, seeing her as nothing more than a body to use. She justified each death as self-defense, convincing herself that she was protecting herself from the same violent men who had abused her over and over. Yet, as the bodies piled up, the lines between self-defense and revenge began to blur. Aileen's killing spree continued, unnoticed by authorities, until 1991, when she was finally arrested. Witnesses had linked her to a stolen car, and the bodies of her victims were discovered nearby. When captured, Aileen didn't try to hide her actions. She confessed to killing 7 men, repeating that she had acted in self-defense. But the law didn't see it that way. The courts determined that her crimes were not just acts of survival. They were acts of revenge. Aileen was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. Her trial became a media spectacle. The defense team tried to frame her as a woman driven to murder by years of abuse and neglect, but the evidence was clear. Aileen had killed with intent, and the courts didn't accept her version of self-defense. In 2002, after more than a decade on death row, she was executed by lethal injection. Her final words, delivered in a calm and defiant voice, were, "I'd just like to say I'm sorry for all the people I've hurt. I've hurt people, but they hurt me too." A woman who had spent her life on the margins of society, killing because she believed it was the only way to survive, was silenced by the very system she had never trusted. Aileen Wuornos's life and death were defined by a world that never gave her a chance. In the end, she wasn't just a woman who killed, she was a woman who was pushed to the edge, driven by a desire for justice that never arrived in her lifetime. Dennis Nilsen, United Kingdom, 1978 to 1983. It began with a smell, a thick, sour odor rising from the drains of a quiet North London apartment block. Tenants complained that something was wrong with the pipes, that the water wasn't draining properly. When plumbers arrived expecting a blockage, they were hit by a smell so foul it made them step back. What surfaced wasn't sludge, it was human flesh. This discovery led police to 23 Cranley Gardens, the home of Dennis Nilsen, a man who appeared unremarkable to those around him. He was quiet, polite, and well-spoken, a man with an air of ordinariness that concealed an all-consuming loneliness. Nilsen had spent much of his life as an outsider, shaped by abandonment and isolation. Born in Fraserburgh, Scotland in 1945, his childhood was marked by the loss of his father and a strained relationship with his mother. His only connection was to his grandfather, whose death at a young age left an indelible mark on him. At just 6 years old, he had felt peace when seeing his grandfather's body, a moment that would haunt him. Death became familiar to him, a constant companion. Years later, Nilsen moved to London, where he worked as a civil servant. He frequented bars, looking for connection, but fearing rejection. His loneliness was a driving force, always hovering in the background. He began luring young men to his apartment, offering them food, shelter, and companionship. His first victim was 14-year-old Stephen Holmes in December 1978. After spending the night drinking and talking, Stephen began to leave, but Nilsen panicked. He reached for a necktie and strangled him. Afterward, Nilsen sat with the body, drinking beside it, unable to let go. He would later say, the boy was still there. For the next 5 years, the pattern continued. The majority of Nilsen's victims were homeless or gay men. Others were heterosexual people. He typically met in bars, on public transport, or, on one occasion, outside his own home. Nilsen met men, many of them homeless or in need of warmth, and brought them home. Once they trusted him, he would strike. Rope or ties were used to strangle them, sometimes drowning them afterward, to make sure they stayed still. But the killings weren't just about death, they were about control. Afterward, He would wash and dress the bodies, sit them up in chairs, and talk to them as though they were still alive. Decomposition soon set in, and Nielsen began hiding the bodies beneath the floorboards, in cupboards, or, when the smell became unbearable, burning the remains in his garden. Between 1978 and 1981, Nielsen killed at least 12 victims in his first apartment. When the space filled, he moved to Cranley Gardens in 1981, a top-floor flat with no garden to hide bodies. He began flushing body parts down the drains. This is what ultimately betrayed him. In February 1983, plumbers arrived to fix a blockage, and the stench from the drains led them to discover the human remains. The police knocked on Nielsen's door that night. He opened it calmly, and when told about the discovery in the drains, sighed. "It's a long story," he said. "You'll need more than one night." In custody, Nielsen confessed immediately, detailing his killings with chilling calmness. He explained how he couldn't bear the thought of his victims leaving, so he made them stay forever. Nielsen's trial in 1983 lasted 6 weeks. The debate over whether he was insane or simply evil was intense. The jury found him guilty of 6 murders and 2 attempted murders, sentencing him to life imprisonment without parole. He spent the rest of his life behind bars, keeping diaries and reflecting on his crimes. Nielsen died in 2018, at the age of 72, after collapsing in his cell. For the victims and their families, the true horror wasn't just the murders. It was the decay that filled Nielsen's home and the lies he buried under the floorboards, the lies that would never be fully uncovered. Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, 1969 to 1980. In the marketplaces of Colombia, the name Pedro Lopez was once spoken in whispers, a ghost story. Mothers told their daughters to keep them close. No one believed one man could be behind so many disappearances. But by the time the truth surfaced, the earth itself had begun to give up his secrets. Pedro Lopez was born in 1948 in Tolima, Colombia. His childhood was brief. Violence, abandonment, and the streets raised him. By his teens, he had already learned that power was the only way to silence pain. By the late 1960s, he was traveling between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, a nameless man, blending into the crowds of mountain villages. His victims were always the same: little girls walking home from school, selling fruit, or fetching water for their families. Lopez would approach softly, promise them candy or coins, and lead them away into the quiet fields. What followed was always the same. He assaulted them, strangled them with his hands, and buried their bodies in shallow graves. He said he turned their faces away so they wouldn't look at me when I did it. For nearly a decade, police ignored the growing list of missing children. In poor towns, disappearances were treated as misfortunes, not crimes. Parents searched in silence, while Lopez moved freely across borders, hunting in daylight. He later bragged that he killed as many as 3 girls every week. In 1980, his luck ended. In Ambato, Ecuador, he tried to abduct a 9-year-old girl from a crowded market. Her screams drew the crowd. Locals caught him, beat him, and held him until police arrived. At first, Lopez denied everything until nature itself turned against him. Heavy rains flooded the hills outside the city, uncovering bones and clothing buried just beneath the surface. Faced with the evidence, Lopez began to talk. He led police to grave after grave, more than 50 in total. Investigators followed him through fields where tiny shoes and faded dresses still lay beneath the soil. Each time they stopped, he would stand silently for a moment, smile faintly, and say, "This one was very pretty." The scale of his crimes was incomprehensible. Over months of interviews, he confessed to killing more than 300 girls across South America. He remembered names, faces, and exact locations. "I am the world's best killer of little girls," he told authorities, and he said it as though he meant it. In 1983, Lopez was convicted of 110 murders in Ecuador, the maximum number allowed by law. But under the country's penal system, the harshest penalty was 16 years. He served 14. In 1994, he was released for good behavior. Colombian police arrested him again briefly, but declared him mentally unfit. 3 years later, he was deemed sane and released from a psychiatric hospital on bail. $50, that's what freedom cost the monster of the Andes. Since then, he has vanished. There are unconfirmed sightings in Colombia, but no arrests, no body, no closure. Some say he died in the jungle. Others say he found new victims. 3 nations failed to stop him, and the world forgot to keep looking. Somewhere in the Andes, a man who confessed to murdering over 300 girls walked away, and no one knows where he went. David Berkowitz, United States, 1976 to 1977. New York City, in the summer of 1976, was a city under siege, sweltering heat, flashing sirens, and fear that never slept. In the midst of disco clubs, flashing lights, and the hum of life, something darker stalked the streets. Young couples parked under streetlights, strangers waiting for buses, anyone walking home late. They all shared the same quiet terror. A man with a .44 caliber revolver was choosing victims at random. No one saw him coming. No one knew who he was. But soon, the city would come to know his name. David Berkowitz, the man who called himself Son of Sam. Born in 1953 and adopted by a working-class couple in the Bronx, Berkowitz's early life was marked by loneliness and rejection. His mother died when he was a teenager, and his relationship with his adoptive father grew distant. Those who knew him described him as intelligent but withdrawn, a boy who never quite fit in. After serving in the U.S. Army, Berkowitz returned to New York adrift, working menial jobs and living alone in a small Yonkers apartment. It was there, in isolation, that his anger and delusions began to fester. The killings started on July 29, 1976. 2 young women sat in a parked car in the Bronx when a man approached in the dark, raised a .44 caliber bulldog revolver, and opened fire. One of them, Donna Loria, was killed instantly. Her friend, Jody Valenti, was wounded but survived. Police had no leads, no suspect, just shell casings and panic spreading through the city. Over the next year, the shootings continued. Berkowitz attacked couples sitting in cars or walking late at night, always using the same gun, always vanishing before anyone could react. His victims were mostly young women with long brown hair, and New York women began cutting or dyeing their hair out of fear. The pattern was random enough to feel unstoppable. The killer struck in Queens, the Bronx, and Brooklyn, leaving behind the same haunting signature. Then came the letters. In April 1977, the New York Daily News received a handwritten note addressed to police and journalist Jimmy Breslin. It was rambling, taunting, and signed Son of Sam. Berkowitz claimed he was obeying voices, specifically a demon dog named Sam, that commanded him to kill. The letter ended with a chilling promise: "I will be back. I will be back." The city erupted in hysteria. New Yorkers avoided the night. The largest manhunt in NYPD history began. The spree ended on August 10, 1977. Police traced a parking ticket issued near one of the shootings to Berkowitz's yellow Ford Galaxy. When they approached his apartment, he smiled and said calmly, "You got me." Inside his car were maps of the crime scenes and the .44 revolver. In his confession, Berkowitz told police that he believed his neighbor's dog was possessed by demons who ordered him to kill. Psychiatrists later diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, but he was found fit to stand trial. David Berkowitz pleaded guilty to 6 murders and 7 attempted murders, receiving 6 consecutive life sentences. Today, he remains incarcerated at Sullivan Correctional Facility in New York, behind bars. He later renounced his Son of Sam persona and claimed to have found religion. But for the millions who lived through those nights of fear, the transformation didn't matter. The Son of Sam wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of how madness can hide in plain sight, waiting for darkness to fall. Tier 3, Robert Berdella, United States, 1984 to 1987. To his neighbors in Kansas City, Robert Berdella seemed like an eccentric but harmless man. He owned a small curio shop called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, where he sold odd trinkets, antiques, and occult items. He was quiet, polite, and well-spoken, the kind of man who faded into the background. But beneath the surface of his calm demeanor was a mind consumed by cruelty. Behind the closed doors of his modest home on Charlotte Street, Berdella was not a collector of antiques. He was a collector of human suffering. Born in 1949, Berdella's early life hinted at the darkness to come. He was an isolated child, bullied by his classmates and emotionally neglected by his father, who favored his athletic younger brother. Withdrawn and intelligent, he began exploring taboo interests early, experimenting with drugs, reading about serial killers, and developing fantasies centered on power and submission. As he grew older, those fantasies became more vivid. By the mid-1970s, after moving to Kansas City, Berdella's fascination with dominance turned into a plan, a calculated desire to control others completely. In 1984, his fantasies became reality. His first known victim was Jerry Howell, a 19-year-old male prostitute, whom Berdella lured to his home with the promise of drugs and money. Once inside, Jerry was drugged, tied to a bed, and subjected to hours of brutal torture. Berdella didn't kill quickly. He wanted his victims conscious, aware, and terrified. He injected them with tranquilizers and caustic substances to keep them alive but helpless, all while recording his acts in a detailed torture log. His notes included descriptions of each act, what tools he used, how long the victim survived, and even the reactions they gave. To Berdella, this was not chaos. It was ritual. Over the next 3 years, Berdella lured 5 more victims, all young men on the margins, runaways, sex workers, and drifters who would not be missed quickly. His home became a dungeon. Victims were chained, gagged, and subjected to electric shocks, injections, and mutilation. He photographed every stage of their suffering, hundreds of images documenting his control. His journals, later discovered by police, read like a grotesque experiment. A scientist observing his subjects, methodically cataloging every wound and reaction. When the victims finally died, either from blood loss, overdose, or asphyxiation, Berdella dismembered their bodies with the same precision he used in torture. He disposed of the remains in trash bags, which were collected with ordinary household garbage. For years, The city's sanitation trucks carried away the evidence of his crimes without anyone realizing what was inside. His downfall came in April 1988, when Chris Bryson, a 22-year-old victim, managed to escape. After days of torture, Bryson loosened his restraints and jumped from a second-floor window, wearing nothing but a dog collar and bleeding from his wrists. He ran to a neighbor's house and begged for help. When police arrived at Berdella's home, they discovered a scene of unspeakable horror. Ropes, syringes, electrical cords, and hundreds of Polaroid photographs showing men in various stages of agony. His journals detailed 6 murders in chilling precision. During interrogation, Berdella spoke calmly, describing his acts without remorse. He said he sought total control over his victims, that the act of torture gave him a sense of godlike power. In 1988, he was convicted of 6 murders, forcible sodomy, and aggravated assault, and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Robert Berdella died in 1992, reportedly of a heart attack while serving his sentence. Even in death, his crimes left a scar on Kansas City, a reminder that behind the quietest smiles can hide the coldest monsters. He didn't kill out of rage or impulse. He killed because he wanted to own pain, to study it, and to keep it, preserved forever in his photographs and journals as trophies of his mastery over life and death. Joachim Kroll, the Ruhr Cannibal, Germany, 1955 to 1976. He was simply a quiet, awkward man who lived alone in a modest apartment in Duisburg, Germany. He worked as a plumber and kept to himself, a man whose eccentricities were overlooked by neighbors. But beneath his ordinary facade lay one of Germany's most grotesque serial killers, whose horrific acts would remain hidden until the stench of his crimes gave him away. Kroll's early life was marked by neglect. Born in 1933 in the industrial town of Heydrich, Germany, he was raised in an emotionally cold home. His father was absent for long periods, and his mother was reportedly indifferent to his needs. From a young age, Kroll was isolated, often ridiculed by peers for his unusual appearance and awkward demeanor. It was in this isolation that his dark impulses began to take root, setting him on a path that would spiral into madness. Kroll had already killed at least 3 women and children. His victims were typically chosen at random, vulnerable individuals who were easy to lure. His first known murder was in 1955, when he abducted a young girl, strangled her, and then sexually assaulted her. He would often keep the bodies of his victims for days, even weeks, hiding them in his apartment. He took pleasure in the decomposition of their remains, sometimes eating parts of their bodies. It was during this period that Kroll's obsession with cannibalism began, a sickening compulsion that would drive his killings for the next 2 decades. Kroll's killings were methodical, but it wasn't until 1976 that his crimes began to unravel. That year, the plumbing in his apartment complex became clogged with a strange, putrid odor. The source of the smell was traced back to his apartment, where plumbers discovered what appeared to be human remains. The body parts, including pieces of flesh and organs, were flushed through the plumbing, clogging the pipes. This discovery led to an investigation that would uncover the full extent of Kroll's gruesome crimes. When authorities searched his apartment, they found disturbing evidence of his twisted behavior. The walls were lined with photographs of his victims, many of whom were children. There were also detailed records, journals documenting each of his murders, and remnants of body parts he had consumed. Kroll had kept pieces of his victims as trophies, often storing them in jars or under his bed. His acts of cannibalism had escalated, and it became clear that his murders were not driven by passion or rage, but by a sickening ritual. During his arrest, Kroll showed no remorse. When questioned, he calmly admitted to killing and eating the victims, describing each act with chilling precision. He explained that he killed out of a sense of need, claiming that he was driven by hunger, not just for food, but for the sense of control and dominance he could achieve by taking another life. He told detectives that the act of cannibalism was an attempt to gain power over those he killed, a way to consume their life force. Kroll's trial in 1977 was a public spectacle, and his chilling confessions only fueled the horror. He was convicted of at least 13 murders, although investigators believe he may have killed many more. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but his life behind bars was just as unsettling as his crimes. Kroll spent his remaining years in prison, writing letters about his killings and offering disturbing insights into his warped mind. He died in prison in 1991 from heart failure, a man whose legacy was forever defined by his brutal and sadistic nature. In the end, Kroll's crimes were not just about violence, they were about the slow, insidious decay of his humanity, a man who, in his desperation, lost all sense of moral compass and became a monster trapped in his own delusions. Fantasy turns to faith, and madness becomes a method. But some killers never stopped, because they were never found. Tier 4. Zodiac Killer, United States, 1960s to 1970s. To most, he was just a name, a phantom that appeared only in the headlines, then disappeared into obscurity. He was not an ordinary murderer. The Zodiac Killer didn't just kill for pleasure or anger. He killed to become something more, to carve his name into history. His victims were nothing more than pawns in a sick game of cat and mouse, a game that he alone controlled. His identity, to this day, remains one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history. It all began on the evening of December 20th, 1968, when two teenagers, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were out on a quiet country road near Vallejo, California. A night meant for a Christmas date turned into horror. A man approached their parked car, ordered them out, and shot them both at point-blank range. No witnesses, no motive. The killer left behind nothing but bodies and questions. The Zodiac's first kill was brutal, but unremarkable in the grand scheme of things. However, it was his second that would send fear through the entire state of California and beyond. On July 4th, 1969, at Blue Rock Springs Park, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau, another couple parked in a remote area, became the Zodiac's next victims. This time, he approached their car, shone a flashlight into their eyes, and then, without a word, opened fire, shooting them both at close range. Darlene Ferrin died almost instantly, but Michael Mageau survived, wounded but alive, to offer a description of the killer. But the Zodiac's biggest victory was yet to come. It was not in his killings, but in his ability to taunt the authorities. Less than a week after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, the Zodiac sent a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle. It was a chilling mix of arrogance and confidence, containing detailed accounts of the murders no one knew and offering up a cipher, a puzzle that he claimed would reveal his true identity. "I like killing people because it is so much fun," the letter began. "It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all." The Zodiac's ciphers, his letters, and his cryptic messages were not just acts of communication. They were his way of drawing a map for the world to follow, with no intention of being caught. But it wasn't just the ciphers. The Zodiac made sure to call attention to his handiwork by taunting the media and the police, daring them to uncover his identity. His killings were methodical, yet random in a disturbing way. In 1969, he targeted a young couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Ann Shepard, who were enjoying a quiet afternoon by Lake Berryessa, near Napa County. The killer approached them wearing a bizarre executioner-style hood, emblazoned with the symbol of a cross within a circle. After tying them up, he stabbed them both repeatedly, then left his signature on the car door. Vallejo, December 20th, 1968, July 4th, 1969, June 26th, 1970, October 27th, 1969, March 22nd, 1970, 4/28/70/74, 70/12, 2070/4, 24/71, 12/4/72, 11/73, 9-27-73, Zodiac. The killer made sure to leave his mark, and once again, he vanished into the night. Just a year later, the Zodiac struck again. On October 11th, 1969, he killed Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver in San Francisco. What set this murder apart was the personal involvement of the Zodiac. After killing Paul Stein, the Zodiac walked away from the crime scene, cutting a piece of Stein's shirt and sending it to the police along with another letter and a new cipher. The police could no longer ignore that the Zodiac had turned his killings into a game. The investigation into the Zodiac's crimes became one of the most frustrating and futile efforts in law enforcement history. Despite his boldness, his elaborate codes, and his cryptic messages, no one could catch him. By the mid-1970s, the Zodiac seemed to vanish, disappearing just as suddenly as he had arrived. In the years that followed, several suspects emerged, men with backgrounds in crime, men who seemed to fit the Zodiac's profile, but none of the theories ever came close to solving the case. His taunts became part of the mythos, and his letters, with their ciphers and disturbing messages, only fueled the mystery. In the late 2000s, new DNA technology was used to re-examine evidence, but the Zodiac's identity remains a chilling, unsolved riddle. The monster of Florence, Italy, 1968 to 1985. It all started on August 21st, 1968, when the bodies of a young couple, Stefano Baldi and Barbara Loyer, were discovered near a secluded lover's lane just outside of Florence. They had been shot in the car in what appeared to be a random act of violence. The crime seemed isolated, tragic, but not entirely out of the ordinary. However, it was only the beginning of a series of brutal killings that would send shockwaves through Italy. Over the next few years, the pattern became disturbingly clear. Young couples, often lovers parked in remote areas, were the target. The victims were always killed with a gunshot, often to the head. But it wasn't just the act of murder that shocked investigators. It was the methodical nature of the killings and the lingering sense of terror that followed each attack. The killer's choice of victims was almost ritualistic. Couples, typically young and in love, parked on quiet, isolated roads, were chosen with eerie precision. The killer would approach, often under the cover of darkness, and shoot them both, almost always with a .22 caliber pistol. But the killings didn't end there. What followed each murder added an even darker layer to the crimes. In several cases, the victims were mutilated post-mortem, with one or both of the victims' bodies subjected to horrific acts of sexual violence. It was as though the killer was not only taking lives, but was also trying to desecrate what he viewed as innocent love. By 1981, the killings had escalated to the point where the police had to acknowledge the existence of a serial killer. The killer was dubbed the Monster of Florence by the press, as his brutal acts, particularly his methodical mutilations, suggested a man driven by sadistic pleasure. Despite the increasing body count, investigators had very little to go on. There were no reliable eyewitnesses, no tangible evidence left behind by the killer. All they had were theories, some of which bordered on the absurd. One theory suggested that the killings were the result of a local cult. Another pointed to a disgruntled lover seeking revenge. But the more the police investigated, the more they realized that they were dealing with a killer who was meticulously covering his tracks, making it nearly impossible for anyone to catch him. In 1985, the killer struck again, this time murdering a young couple, Susanna Cambi and Stefano Baldi, in an area near the town of Scandicci. This attack would mark the final known murder attributed to the Monster of Florence. The police had been closing in, but the killer was always one step ahead. The investigation turned into a frustrating string of dead ends, with dozens of suspects, each one more implausible than the last. A local man named Pietro Pacciani, who lived in the countryside near Florence, was arrested and charged with the killings in 1993, largely due to circumstantial evidence. However, the case against him was weak, and after years of legal battles, Pacciani was acquitted in 1996. The investigation continued to grind forward, but no one was ever truly convicted for the brutal murders of the couples. The true identity of the Monster of Florence remains a mystery to this day. Some believe that Pacciani was the killer, while others think the true murderer may have escaped justice entirely. Over the years, several other individuals have been implicated, but none have been definitively linked to the murders. In 2004, a new investigation was launched, but it too yielded no new leads. The case of the Monster of Florence remains one of Italy's most notorious unsolved mysteries, a haunting reminder of the violence that can lie just beneath the surface of a peaceful, beautiful country. The Cleveland Torso Murderer, United States, 1930s. In the shadow of Cleveland's industrial heart, a disturbing mystery unfolded that would haunt the city for decades. Between 1935 and 1938, the Cleveland Torso Murderer, an elusive, brutal killer, left behind more than just a trail of victims. He left pieces of them. A torso here, an arm there, dismembered bodies scattered in abandoned areas and river valleys. The killer didn't just take lives, he dismantled them, leaving the city paralyzed with fear and desperate for answers. To this day, the true identity of the Cleveland Torso Murderer remains unknown, and his crimes remain some of the most horrific and grotesque in American criminal history. The first body was discovered on September 23, 1935. A man's torso, severed cleanly at the waist, was found in Kingsbury Run, an isolated area along the Cuyahoga River, just outside Cleveland's city center. The victim was initially thought to be the result of a random act of violence, perhaps a robbery gone wrong. But what horrified investigators was not only the dismemberment, but the fact that there were no hands, no head, just a body, meticulously cut apart. No one knew who he was, and no one knew where the rest of his body was. No witnesses had seen anything, and the killer left nothing behind except that unsettling image of a cleanly severed body. What followed was a pattern so chilling it would become ingrained in the city's collective memory: dismemberment, mutilation, and disposal. Over the next 2 years, the killer returned again and again, leaving more dismembered bodies strewn across the city. Each crime was eerily similar to the last. His victims were often marginalized individuals, transients, vagrants, and people who had little connection to the rest of society. They were often picked at random, lured into secluded areas, and then dismembered with unnerving precision. Some bodies were discovered only after being dislodged from the river, dragged by the water's current. Some were so badly mutilated that identification was impossible. The first confirmed killing after the discovery of the first torso came in 1936, when a woman's torso was discovered near East 9th Street, again in the Kingsbury Run area. This body, too, was dissected with horrifying precision. The limbs severed from the body, the torso left behind as a sickening reminder of the killer's signature. The mutilation was so methodical, it suggested that the killer not only had the stomach to kill, but the knowledge to carry out these acts of dismemberment. The brutality grew more apparent with each subsequent victim. As the months went on, the bodies began to accumulate. By 1938, the total count had reached at least 12 confirmed victims, but the body count was likely higher. The killer's method was systematic. In every case, the victims were hacked apart with precision, their heads and hands removed, leaving the authorities with little more than a torso. In some cases, the bodies were dressed before being disposed of. The killer seemed to have an obsession with anonymity, both for himself and his victims, stripping them of their identities in the most violent manner possible. The body parts were often discarded in abandoned shacks, dumped in rivers, or hidden in vacant lots, always isolated, always unreachable by those who could have stopped him. What made the case even more terrifying was the inability of law enforcement to find any solid leads. Investigators were left with no physical evidence linking the killings, no clear motive, and no connections between the victims. Despite public pressure and the growing fear in the city, the police were unable to make any progress. For years, the case dragged on, becoming an unspoken ghost in Cleveland's streets. In 1938, the killings abruptly stopped. The last body was found in June of that year, and after that, the killings ceased. The lack of a definitive breakthrough led many to believe that the killer had either moved on to another area or was dead. The case was eventually closed, though rumors about who the killer could have been continued to swirl. Several suspects were brought into the investigation, some of whom were locals with violent pasts, but none could be definitively linked to the crimes. The murders remain unsolved to this day. The case of the Cleveland torso murderer is often cited as one of the most mysterious and gruesome serial killings in American history. Despite modern forensic techniques, the identity of the killer remains elusive. Some believe the killer may have been a butcher, a medical professional, or someone with extensive knowledge of human dissection. Others speculate that he could have been an anonymous drifter, someone whose acts of violence were disconnected from any larger motive. To this day, the investigation remains open, but the killer's identity continues to elude justice. His gruesome acts left an indelible mark on the city of Cleveland, a city haunted by the ghost of a man who dismembered his victims and then vanished into thin air. Servant Girl, Annihilator, Austin, Texas, 1884 to 1885. In the heart of 1880s, Austin, Texas, under the dusty skies, and amidst the bustle of a city on the rise, a hidden terror began to lurk. The sound of horse-drawn carts and clattering feet on cobblestone streets was often interrupted by whispers of a nightmare unfolding in the shadows. Young women, servants to wealthier families, were found murdered under mysterious circumstances, their bodies left in horrifying disarray. The killer, dubbed the servant girl annihilator by the press, was not just another criminal. He was a specter, a figure whose identity would remain a nightmare that never faded, even as time wore on. His murders were not just acts of violence, they were rituals, designed to instill terror in a city that had never known such brutal fear. It all began on December 30th, 1884, when 16-year-old Maggie Brown, a servant girl, was brutally attacked in her home. Her body was discovered by her employer, badly disfigured, her life snuffed out with terrifying precision. She had been struck multiple times with a sharp weapon, her skull crushed, her limbs mangled. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of robbery. It was as if the killer had walked into the house, committed his heinous act, and left, as if nothing had happened. Her death was just the beginning. As the months passed, the killings became increasingly brutal. Sarah Harper, another young servant, was found murdered in a similar fashion in February 1885. Her body was also dismembered, her head severed, and her limbs scattered across her home. This second killing was different, though. The killer seemed to grow bolder, sending a sickening message to the community. The horror was escalating, and it was clear that this was not some random act of violence. This was a pattern, a ritual that would soon become a sickening part of Austin's history. As the body count rose, it became clear that the killer was targeting young women, specifically those who worked as servants for wealthy families. He preyed on those who had no voice, who lived in the shadows of society. The more he killed, the more the terror spread, as people began to wonder, who was this person? Was he someone local, someone who knew the city's layout so well? Or was he a drifter, a man whose violence had no limits, moving from town to town, leaving only carnage behind? The most chilling part of the murders was the discovery of the crime scenes. Each victim was found in their sleeping quarters, often slashed with a blade or struck with a blunt instrument. What set these killings apart was the lack of identification and the mutilation of the victims' bodies. Heads were removed, faces disfigured, and in some cases, pieces of their bodies were mutilated posthumously. There was an overwhelming sense of deliberate cruelty. The killer didn't just kill, he took pleasure in the disfigurement, in the complete and utter destruction of the victim's identity. By the time of the fourth murder, the city was in a state of panic. The press was relentless, speculating about the killer's identity, but no one could make a definitive connection. The police had no clear suspect, and with the limited forensic tools of the time, there were no substantial leads. Rumors began to swirl. Could this killer be someone close to the community? Someone the police trusted? Or was it a man whose identity could never be understood? Someone whose very existence was tied to the violence and fear he created? On April 1st, 1885, the killer claimed his final known victim, a 23-year-old servant named Eliza Shelley. She was found in the early hours of the morning, her body desecrated in the same horrific manner as the others. By now, fear had completely overtaken Austin. The community was paralyzed, unable to trust even their neighbors. With the killer still at large, suspicion grew. Everyone was a potential target, and no one was safe. Despite the growing public pressure, the police could never make an arrest. The killer's methodical nature, the lack of any concrete evidence, and the victim's lack of social standing ensured that the case remained open, but unsolved. No suspects were ever definitively linked to the murders, and no true breakthrough was ever made. Even as late as 1887, after the killings ceased, the case remained a ghost, an unresolved piece of Austin's history. Some were caught, some disappeared. But in the final tier, the light disappears completely. What remains is the inhuman. Tier 5. Issei Sagawa, Japan/France, 1981. In 1981, Paris, the city of love and light, became the backdrop for one of the most grotesque and chilling crimes ever to stain its streets. Amidst the cafes and art galleries, a young Japanese student named Issei Sagawa committed an unspeakable act. He murdered, dissected, and cannibalized a woman in his apartment. It was a crime so vile that it left the public and law enforcement stunned, and it would set the stage for a series of bizarre events that would make Sagawa one of the most infamous figures in modern criminal history. But what made his case even more disturbing wasn't just the act of murder. It was how the loopholes of the legal system allowed him to walk free, turning him into a public figure. Sagawa's victim, Renee Hartevelt, was a Dutch student who had been living in Paris. She was the innocent victim of a man whose obsession with her was twisted beyond reason. He had fantasized about her for months, imagining what it would be like to consume her flesh. On June 11th, 1981, he invited her to his apartment on the pretense of helping him with his academic work. Once there, he attacked her violently, stabbing her in the neck. He didn't kill her immediately. Instead, he bound her up, and in the brutal hours that followed, he dissected her body with a surgical knife, carefully removing parts of her flesh. What followed was unimaginable. Sagawa cannibalized parts of Renee's body, eating her flesh in an attempt to absorb her, as he described in later interviews. He cut off her breasts, took pieces of her thighs, and even attempted to cook some of her flesh in a frying pan. But Sagawa didn't stop there. After a few days of consuming her remains, he discarded her body in a suitcase, dumping her dismembered remains in the Bois de Boulogne, a public park near Paris. The discovery of the body led to Sagawa's arrest, but the case quickly turned into a nightmare for law enforcement. Sagawa was not just a murderer. He was a man who seemed to defy logic. During his trial, it became clear that his mental state was not as straightforward as initially believed. Sagawa's defense team claimed that he was insane, arguing that his obsessive fantasies had driven him to kill and eat Renee. Despite his grotesque crime, the court ruled that Sagawa was not criminally responsible, citing his psychological issues and his history of violent fantasies. He was declared mentally unfit for trial and sent to a psychiatric hospital. However, after just 2 years in a French mental institution, Sagawa was released. His release came about due to a legal loophole. Japanese authorities refused to take him back to Japan to face trial, as they didn't consider his actions in France to be criminal under their laws. With the bizarre twist of legal proceedings and the failure of justice, Sagawa walked free. He was never charged for his crime in Japan, and his time in France became just another chapter in a story that defied reason and morality. What followed Sagawa's release was even more disturbing. Rather than fading into obscurity, he became a public figure in Japan. He wrote books, appeared on television, and even made a living discussing his crime and his cannibalistic urges. He became a celebrity of sorts, a figure who was celebrated for his notoriety, not his remorse. In interviews, Sagawa described the act of cannibalism as though it was simply a part of his identity, a part of his life that he would never regret. He turned his gruesome crime into a bizarre media spectacle, feeding off the public's fascination with his inhuman acts. To this day, Issei Sagawa remains a figure who blurs the line between infamy and celebrity. His crime, though repulsive, has made him a curiosity for some, an object of morbid fascination. He continues to profit from his notoriety, living a life free from punishment, his name forever etched into the annals of horror and depravity. H. Holmes, United States, 1890s. In 1893, Chicago prepared to host the world's Columbian Exposition, a grand celebration of human progress and innovation. It was a city alive with ambition, its streets lit by electricity, its skyline filled with new architecture. But while millions came to marvel at the achievements of the modern world, one man was building something far darker just a few miles away. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H. Holmes, and beneath his charm and civility lay one of the most sadistic minds in American history. Holmes arrived in Chicago years before the fair, presenting himself as a successful doctor and businessman. With his sharp suit, polite smile, and quick intelligence, he was the picture of confidence. People trusted him instantly. He used that trust to acquire property and build what would later become infamous as the Murder Castle. Located in the Inglewood neighborhood, it stood 3 stories tall, part pharmacy, part hotel, and entirely built for death. Behind its respectable brick facade, Holmes designed a labyrinth of hidden rooms, soundproof chambers, false walls, secret staircases, and trapdoors that led to nowhere. Many rooms were fitted with gas lines, allowing Holmes to asphyxiate victims without ever entering the room. By 1892, Holmes opened the building to visitors coming to Chicago for the exposition. Young women looking for work or lodging were frequent targets. They were drawn in by Holmes's charm and his promises of employment at his pharmacy or hotel. Once inside, they vanished. The rooms became tombs. Some victims were gassed, others strangled, and some were subjected to slow torture. In the basement, Holmes had built what resembled a miniature crematorium, along with acid vats and dissecting tables. He disposed of the remains with chilling precision, burning, dissolving, or selling skeletons to medical schools. Every trace of his crimes was calculated, every disappearance neatly erased. Holmes was not only a killer, he was a con man. Many of his murders were driven by profit. He took out life insurance policies on employees and lovers, later killing them to collect the money. He seduced women, gained their trust, then robbed them of both their fortunes and their lives. His crimes went unnoticed for years because he appeared respectable. A doctor, a gentleman, a man too educated to be a monster. His downfall began when he partnered with an associate named Benjamin Pitezel in a fraudulent insurance scheme. Holmes killed Pitezel and later murdered 3 of Pitezel's children to cover his tracks. The trail of deceit eventually led detectives to him. In 1894, Holmes was arrested in Boston, initially for fraud, but soon investigators uncovered the gruesome reality behind his hotel. When police entered the murder castle, they found chambers stained with blood, rusted instruments, and remains hidden in lime pits and furnaces. The building was a house of horrors unlike anything the nation had seen. In 1895, Holmes was convicted of murder. He confessed to killing 27 people, though the true number is believed to be far higher, possibly over 200. On May 7, 1896, he was hanged in Philadelphia. Witnesses said he remained calm until the very end, never showing remorse. The murder castle was demolished soon after, but its legend endured. For all its hidden rooms and secret passages, its darkest secret was the man himself, a killer who turned genius into evil and progress into horror. Fritz Hamann, Germany, 1918 to 1924. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany was a country drowning in despair. Its economy shattered, its people starving, and its cities haunted by the ghosts of war. Among the ruins of this broken nation, the city of Hanover became the hunting ground of one of history's most disturbing killers. Fritz Hamann, a man whose charm and apparent kindness hid a horror that would shake Germany to its core. Hamann was no outcast or stranger to society. Born in 1879, he grew up in a modest home, served briefly in the military, and later made a living as a butcher and petty trader. By all appearances, he was a man of routine, a talkative, helpful neighbor who was often seen around the marketplace and even acted as a police informant. But behind the friendly face was a man whose impulses were monstrous. Hamann's charm made him trustworthy, and his reputation allowed him to operate in plain sight. The people of Hanover saw a businessman. They did not see a killer. His crimes began in 1918, at a time when Germany's streets were full of displaced young men, orphans, runaways, and war veterans with nowhere to go. They were desperate for shelter, food, and companionship. Hamann exploited that desperation. He lured his victims, usually teenage boys and young men, to his apartment with promises of work, food, or a warm bed. Once inside, they met their end. Hamann's method was intimate and cruel. He strangled his victims with his bare hands or a length of cord, sometimes biting their throats in what he described as a love frenzy. When the silence returned, the real horror began. Hamann's background as a butcher shaped what came next. He dismembered the bodies with a precision that shocked investigators later. He cut away flesh, separated bone from muscle, and drained the blood as if he were preparing an animal carcass. But the nightmare didn't stop there. In one of the most horrifying details ever uncovered in a murder case, Hamann sold the flesh of his victims as meat on the black market. During a time of food shortages, locals unknowingly bought what he called fine pork, never realizing they were consuming human flesh. It was murder turned into commerce, a grotesque business built on human suffering. For years, Hamann operated freely, the missing men dismissed as vagrants who had moved on. But by 1924, the pattern of disappearances became too large to ignore. Police began investigating after bones and skulls were found floating in the Lena River near his apartment. The breakthrough came when one of Hamann's associates, following a dispute, informed the police about his crimes. When officers entered Hamann's apartment, they discovered bloodstains on the walls, meat hooks, and piles of human remains. The smell of decay was overwhelming. Confronted with the evidence, Hamann confessed to at least 24 murders, though he hinted that there were more. His tone remained eerily calm as he described each killing, sometimes smiling as though recounting routine tasks. At his trial in 1925, Hamann captivated the courtroom with his composure. He seemed proud, even amused, by the attention. He admitted to the killings, describing his actions as business. He was convicted of 24 murders and sentenced to death by beheading. On April 15, 1925, he faced the guillotine. Witnesses said he went to his death without fear. After his execution, police burned his apartment and destroyed the evidence, hoping to erase his legacy. But Fritz Hamann's story lived on, not just as a tale of murder, but as a chilling reminder of what happens when evil hides behind familiarity. He was the man next door, the friendly butcher, the one people trusted, and in the shadows of post-war Germany, he turned hunger and despair into his tools, feeding the city, one victim at a time.